Britain from 1914 to 1945, the wars and interwar era. The outbreak of the First World War displaced people across Europe and around the world. Throughout the conflict, Britain was seen as a place of refuge for many of those escaping persecution. At the same time, the Allied war effort was powered by a political economy that relied on the exchange of people, goods and services between Commonwealth and partner countries. These factors combined to create greater migration to Britain from places as far afield as China and the Caribbean. This meant that by the beginning of the 20th century, the makeup of Britain's coastal land inner city communities diversified further. In 1918, the First World War ended. Peace brought demobilisation and troops began to return home. However, Britain's economy had been shattered by war and a surplus labour population struggled to find work. Long-held suspicions about workers from minority backgrounds and suggestions that they were stealing jobs persisted. By 1919, tensions reached climax at seaports throughout Britain. Race riots broke between working seamen of minority backgrounds and their white native British counterparts. In their wake, the restrictions that had been introduced and placed upon German soldiers during the First World War were extended to cover all seamen of minority backgrounds living within the UK. This meant that even those who had immigrated to Britain before the war had to carry an identity card, report regularly to the police and obey a curfew. From then on and through to the Second World War, British citizens risked losing their citizenship for marrying immigrants. Yet, despite this, unions between white British women and men from minority communities were commonplace in areas where they lived as neighbours. The largest mixed population centres back then could be found within South Shields, Toxteth in Liverpool, Cardiff's Tiger Bay and London's Docklands. Research captured within the study the era of moral condemnation, mixed-race people in Britain 1920 to 1950 suggested that although they faced prejudice from some people, mixed families went on to create new communities in which those from different backgrounds swapped cultural traditions. The research also highlighted how official perceptions of mixed families contrasted with the way these families experienced life. Newspaper reports from the period portrayed neighbourhoods of mixed families as dangerous and transgressive, rife with crime, prostitution and gambling. At the time, researchers who studied what was often called the colour problem labelled women in interracial relationships as lower class and lacking in morals, and their children as tragic social outcasts. Even those who tried to be sympathetic seemed unable to conceive the notion that children of mixed origins could be brought up in loving and stable families. Government guidance specifically advised British women not to marry Chinese, Hindu, Muslim or black men. Some in public office even called for the introduction of anti-miscegenation laws similar to those in South Africa at the time. The extent of the prejudice toward people of minority backgrounds and those of mixed descent was perhaps most surprising because Britain's success within the First and Second World Wars had heavily relied on soldiers from across the Commonwealth being prepared to join up and risk losing their lives by fighting for the Allied cause. Britain within the years 1945 to 1965, the Windrush era. Still, when the Second World War ended in 1945, the Foreign Office forcibly repatriated 1,362 Chinese sailors who had settled in Liverpool after serving in the Merchant Navy. Government records do not mention their families, but news reports from the time indicate that at least 150 of the men were married to British women, and that between them they had up to 450 children. Ironically, as the forced repatriation saga went on, policymakers in Britain were recognising that more men and women would be needed to help rebuild Britain's crippled cities and economy. The British government soon reluctantly adopted a policy that invited greater migration from Commonwealth countries to its shores. People from across the world soon took up the invitation, seeking new jobs and opportunities, beginning with the arrival of the SS Windrush from Jamaica in 1948. The 493 people the SS Windrush carried would in preceding years be joined in by others from the Caribbean, Asia and the rest of the world, diversifying Britain's population to a scale not previously seen. As it diversified, Britain's population of people from mixed backgrounds also increased. However, back then, people within interracial relationships and their children continued to be labelled with what today would be considered to be highly derogatory terms. The 1960s is often romanticised as a golden period in British social history. Whilst the Cold War raged globally, the turmoil within British society between traditional conservatism and a new wave of liberal thinking that gave power to the people was at the heart of the liberal versus conservative debate. Was the question, what should British society look like moving forward? Some people worried that British jobs, culture and traditions were under the threat of being lost. Others embraced opportunities heralded by an ever-diversifying post-imperial Britain. The tensions between conservative and liberal thinking were also reflected in popular culture such as film and TV programming. For example, in 1967, through the movie Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Hollywood explored challenges faced by couples within interracial relationships on the silver screen. Just a year later, the television series Star Trek made history with an episode that showcased the first ever on-screen kiss between a white man and a black woman. It was also in 1968 that an MP from Wolverhampton, Enoch Powell, made his infamous Rivers of Blood speech in a hotel in Birmingham. He suggested that migration would lead to rivers of blood, with the white man being under the whip of the black man. Powell argued that new migrants should be incentivised to return to their native countries and that government support of migration to the UK should be ended. Opposing his view was Prime Minister Edward Heath, who accepted instead that Britain would be strongest moving forward as a multicultural society. His Conservative government introduced the first Race Relations Act that same year. Powell's white-only anti-migration stance struck a chord within some members of the general public. It became the principles within which the National Front, a right-wing political party, set its agenda. This helped to propel it to the height of its success by the mid-1970s. The National Front's limited election victories were overshadowed, however, by the increasing notoriety its marches gained for the violence they often resulted in, as was the case as shown here within these images of the Lewisham race riot of 1977. During this period, primetime TV schedule in Britain included series such as Love Thy Neighbour, a sitcom about neighbours of different racial and ethnic origins living nearby each other, and others such as Till Death Do Us Part. These shows regularly reflected publicly held misconceptions, prejudices and concerns about the new multicultural Britain. These concerns were also felt against a backdrop of what was a bleak period of economic growth. In an era of new thinking, workers wanted better rights, conditions and pay, as well as job protection from the privatisation of publicly owned services. Minority groups were often portrayed as another threat to job security. Union marches and strikes shut down factories and power stations, crippled successive governments during this period, and throughout this era the term half-caste was still commonly used to describe a person of multiple heritage origins. By the turn of the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher's government was pushing for privatisation and capitalism on a global scale. The resulting riches made within the city Britain period economic boom, there were genuine concerns that this newfound wealth was not being distributed fairly to areas across Britain that were experiencing industrial decline. But traditional working class areas were most vulnerable to the challenges this posed, for within them young people and many others increasingly faced a future of unemployment and limited opportunity. This led to fears of new degrees of violence breaking out on the streets. Eventually, rioting did result across England, with much of it being upon heavy-handed policing, housing working-class alienation. The flashpoints were most seriously felt within Britain's growing multicultural communities and included parts of London and Birmingham. In their aftermath, researchers took a closer look into the reasons why rioting had occurred in places like Brixton in 1981 and Handsworth in 1985. They identified historically fragmented race relations within them and perceptions of inequality between groups as other contributory causing factors of the violence. This understanding helped give rise to new forms of policy thinking. In the decades to follow, this new thinking would advocate promoting the building of stronger communities by celebrating diversity, embracing shared heritage, and better resourcing minority communities. It is thinking that has shaped the very DNA of bodies such as the Heritage Lottery Fund and continues to do so to this day. Britain within the years 1987 to 2007, the Cool Britannia era. By the end of the 1980s, the term half-caste began to be phased out of acceptance by mainstream British society. It was replaced by the term mixed race. At the beginning of the 1990s, ongoing frustrations about perceived or real inequality, compounded by the alleged racially motivated murder of Stephen Lawrence, the subsequent botched police investigation into his death, and the preceding government inquiries, would eventually lead to further reforms within police services. These continue to attempt to address its institutionally racist social stigma. Meanwhile, splits within the Conservative Party, continued concerns about wealth distribution from privatisation, economic challenges, and a belief that the Conservatives failed to reflect modern Britain, contributed to John Major's government receiving a crushing electoral blow in 1997. The arrival of Blair's government that year signalled a rethink of what Britain represented. Suddenly, Britain was considered cool and stronger because of its diversity. This may have had a positive impact on those within interracial relationships and their children, although the extent of which this was so remains unclear. East is East, a comedy about an interracial South Asian white British family, was a box office success in 1999. While it was noted for its nature, critics that it continued to portray interracial families as being dysfunctional, comical, some argued. During the 1990s, the term mixed race was debated and disliked in some quarters for its negative connotation of people within the category being mixed up. The term dual heritage was suggested instead, embracing the fact that a person's origin is more than just their race and should also include recognition of their ethnicity. Despite this, the term mixed race remains commonly used. This continues to be the case through to this day. In 2001, the term mixed race was officially added to the consensus. This marked the first time in British history that people who believed that they fitted into this category could choose it as a category that attempted to recognise them. In 2007, Tony Blair stepped down as Britain's Prime Minister. The EU expanded further that same year. Britain within the years 2008 to present time, the post-millennial era. The millennium had brought with it significant changes across Europe. New additions to the European Union, along with opportunities afforded through it with changes to migration rules, meant that it was possible to move between member country borders to find work. By 2008, and increasingly since then, these changes have enabled new communities from Eastern and Central Europe to migrate to Britain, while some Britons have chosen to move away from it. These movements have further changed the makeup of British society. During this period, the term dual heritage has increasingly become replaced with the use of the term multiple heritage. It is also within this era that people fitting into the multiple heritage category, as well as those within interracial relationships, have increasingly received greater recognition for their contribution to the UK's development. Now more than ever before, mixed families are more regularly portrayed within the mainstream media as being part of the norm. Changes are important, not least because today people of multiple heritage backgrounds make up the UK's fastest growing population. In spite of this, challenges that prevent their successful acceptance and progress within society remain. What is beyond doubt is that the very existence of multiple heritage people, their history and growing population size, reflect changes that have occurred within British society that continue to contribute towards shaping its future.